Well, first of all, I did meet my wife through the New York Society for General Semantics, but her name is not Anne, it's Arlen. That is of absolutely no importance to anybody here except to me. I'd like to get her name right. The only other person I know named Arlen is Arlen Specter, who was the man who invented the magic bullet theory, explained the Kennedy assassination by the bullet turning three. Okay, now you can all hear me, right? Yeah, okay. The first important point is my wife's name is Arlen. And where was I going from there? Where do I live? That's a very interesting question. Where do I live? According to the post office, I live in Santa Cruz, California. That's Spanish for Holy Cross. If Jesus had lived later, it would be Holy Lethal Injection, I assume. But that's what the post office claims I live there. Everybody around that area claims I live in Capitola. Well, virtually everybody. As a matter of fact, if I walk a half block from my house, I'm definitely in Capitola because there's a shopping center there, and all the stores in the shopping center advertise as being in Capitola. So how come I'm in Santa Cruz? Because the post office put me there. A couple of years ago, the post office sent out the ballot saying, we're thinking of rezoning. How many of you would rather be counted as part of Capitola? And it seems almost everybody voted they wanted to be part of Capitola. And apparently the post office decided that was too much work because they sent out a notice saying, apparently our questionnaire wasn't worded properly. 80% of the people would rather be in Capitola, but we don't think they understood the question, so we'll send you another questionnaire later. And that was about 3 years ago. We haven't got another questionnaire. I think the post office doesn't want to go to the trouble of changing all their forms. But whether I live in Santa Cruz or Capitola became even more confusing when something was stolen out of our car. And since the post office says we're in Santa Cruz, we call the Santa Cruz police. And when they got our address, they said, "You're not in Santa Cruz, you're in Capitola." So we called the Capitola police, and we gave them when we gave them the address, they said, "You're not in Capitola, you're in Live Oak. Call the sheriff." So we called the sheriff, and he said, "Yeah, you're in Live Oak." So now I know I live in Live Oak according to the sheriff, in Santa Cruz according to the post office, and in Capitola according to the Santa Cruz police. And this is not a trivial matter. It's actually quadrivial. Because back in the 70s, I was involved with the Physics Consciousness Research Group, which included Jack Sarfati, who has the wildest website you can find on the World Wide Web, Nick Herbert, who has written Quantum Reality and Faster Than Light and other interesting books on quantum mechanics, Fritjof Capra, who wrote The Tao of Physics, Fred Wolf, who's written so many books on quantum mechanics I can hardly begin to list them all, The Body Quantum, and several others. I was the resident science fiction writer. You see, my first book, Illuminatus, not my first book, but the first book to get any attention. I had 3 books before that, which nobody paid any attention to. Now they're all back in print again, but that's another story. The first book that got a lot of attention was published by Dell, and it was such a strange book. Even I admitted it was strange. It was something utterly unique. I was very proud when Timothy Leary compared it to Ulysses, because that was actually what I had in mind, was something equally revolutionary in a different way. And Dell didn't know how to package it and promote it, so they called it science fiction. So nobody bought it but science fiction fans. It took about 10 years before other people began to discover the book. Meanwhile, because the first one was called science fiction, all my books landed in the science fiction section, including my nonfiction, which made me wonder, am I writing science fiction when I think I'm writing science fact? Well, it's a matter of how you define what's a fact and what's fiction. Then after a while, when more and more of my books didn't seem to belong in science fiction, I wrote a detective story, I wrote 3 historical novels, and I wrote a lot of books on psychology and semantics. So I suddenly found myself in the New Age section, God knows why. And there I was next to von Daniken, just because my name begins with a W. And I suffered from that indignity for years. And I just heard recently that Barnes & Noble has moved me from New Age to philosophy. So I'm now next to Wittgenstein, which is where I'd much rather be than next to von Daniken. But the fact that, according to one model or grid or reality tunnel, I live in Santa Cruz, and according to another one, I live in Capitola, and according to a third, I live in Live Oak, has helped me immeasurably in understanding the problems in quantum mechanics that we used to discuss in the Physics Consciousness Research Group back in the 70s. Of course, what it all comes down to, I don't speak in E-prime. I've been writing in E-prime a lot lately, but I've written 2 books in E-prime and most of my recent articles in E-prime. I haven't yet learned to speak E-prime. So if you hear an is now and then, none of us are perfect. Yeah, there was another lapse. There was an R in there. The map is not the territory. The quantum physics, you set up one experimental apparatus, build up a mathematical theory to fit the results you get, and you have proven that light travels in waves. You set up another experimental apparatus, another theoretical system to account for what you get, and you prove that light travels in particles. So back in the 20s, there was a big argument. Well, actually, it goes back to the previous century, but it heated up in the 1920s. Does light travel as waves or as particles? Is light waves or is it particles? And when the answer seemed to be light is waves when it feels like being waves, and it's particles when it feels like being particles, light is waves and light is particles, that led to a lot of physicists to promulgate the theory that the universe is irrational, which I think is the worst identification of identity that's come up so far in this discussion. Supposing you reformulate it in E prime, as Dr. Borland would have us do, you can't say the photons are particles. You say under certain experimental conditions, photons behave like particles. And you can't say photons are waves. You can only say under certain experimental conditions, photons behave like waves. Now there's no contradiction, no paradox, no problem, and no need to say the universe is irrational. It's just the is of identity that makes the universe appear irrational. Excuse me. Have I got some water here?
Right under there.
Pardon me while I... I think the importance of E prime came home to me very strongly when people started shooting up abortion clinics. Well, usually they were actually women's centers who did all sorts of women's medicine besides abortion, but they did do abortions too, so they got to be called abortion clinics. And people would go in and shoot people, set off bombs and whatnot. And this was all over the philosophical disagreement. Is the fetus a human being or is it not? Which is like, do I live in Live Oak or do I live in Capitola or do I live in Santa Cruz? In E prime, you can't even ask the question. In E prime, the closest you can come is under your present philosophical and scientific understanding, do you classify the fetus as human? Or under your present philosophical and scientific understanding, do you classify the fetus as not human? Or the answers to those questions are, under my present philosophical and scientific thinking, I classify the fetus as human. And under my present scientific and philosophical thinking, I do not classify the fetus as human. If people were to learn to talk in E prime, they'd be much less passionate, it seems to me, and they'd be much less likely to shoot guns at one another. There are many other examples. I'd like to move on to allness. I'm just doing a rough rundown on how Korzybski continues to influence me. All the events in the going on in the world, I tend to see through a Korzybskian grid. He made a bigger impression on me than just about any writer I've ever read. When I was going to high school, the civics and English teachers and all the humanities teachers. I was in a technical high school, but we had to take some humanities courses in those days. I don't know if they have to take any courses in anything these days, but my general impression is that everybody who graduated since 1970 doesn't know anything. But maybe that just shows I'm getting old. But all the physics, all the social science, humanities teachers, all made very clear to us that Hitler made a terrible mistake in making generalizations about miscellaneous groups of human beings. He took a large collection of human beings, and he said, these people, the Jews, have the following characteristics, all of them. That's what Korzybski meant by allness. And that was what lay behind the Holocaust. And anybody who thinks Korzybski's ideas are not very, very important, just remember what the Holocaust was, what happened. And it all resulted from Jews are such and such. How many Jews did Hitler meet in his life? 100, 200, 300? How many Jews are there in the world? 15 million, 20 million? I don't know. He thought he knew all about all the Jews in the world. He only knew a few things about a few of them. And probably the only ones he remembered were the ones that would hurt his feelings sometime, whether by saying his paintings weren't very good. Somebody said, Adolf, that painting sucks. And 6 million people died later on because of allness. I don't want to be too controversial. But I would like to ask, how many men does Gloria Steinem know well enough to make all the statements about the male sex? Does she know 200, 300, 500? Is that enough to generalize about, I think, 2.5 billion men on the planet now? The paradoxes of quantum physics, to return to them, all result from confusing the map with the territory. We make maps and we find out for different parts of quantum physics we need different maps. We find the maps don't exactly fit together into one picture, so we learn we need different maps for different purposes, which shouldn't be a surprise. You don't look at a weather map to find out political divisions. You don't look at a political map to find out weather divisions, and so on. But confusing the map with the territory, you begin to get the impression the world is rather irrational. We don't realize we put the lines there. There's still a lot of confusion about this, even among professional physicists, many of whom I have gotten to know intimately. When you get 3 physicists arguing about the Copenhagen interpretation, it's like 3 socialists arguing about what's real socialism. It's enough to melt the polar ice caps. But this doesn't happen with Capitola, Santa Cruz, and Live Oak because we know we put the lines there. But generally we forget we put the lines there and we think the lines exist outside of us. We think our belief system is an exact reflection of an objective and unchanging world, which is the hallucination that Korzybski tried to cure. I try to popularize this in my own way by the 2 mantras. Don't believe totally in anybody's BS, belief system. And the second commandment is like unto the first. Don't believe totally in your own BS. Because after all, when you begin to believe in your own BS, you enter the state that I call self-hypnotic ideational trance. And pretty soon you got a head full of self-hypnotic ideational trance, or SHIT. You don't want to go around with a head like that. Peter Bogdanovich, like Jean-Luc Godard, started out as a film critic and later became a film director, and a very good one, I think. He was persuaded to become an actor in a movie that Orson Welles made that has yet to be released, called The Other Side of the Wind. And the way Orson persuaded Peter Bogdanovich to become an actor was when Bogdanovich said, I'm not an actor, I don't know how to act. Wells said, everybody is an actor. How's that for an allness and an isnness statement? And Bogdanovich says, what do you mean? And Wells said, every conversation is a performance. We draw the line. We say this is acting and this is conversation, but every conversation is a performance. Read Luckman's presentation of the self in everyday life. We're always putting on a persona to deal with the world around us. So everybody is an actor in a certain sense, or at least we can use the model of acting to describe a great deal of human behavior. So therefore, don't be afraid if anybody asks you to appear in a movie. I just came back from appearing in a German movie called 23, which for those of you who lack Deutsch means 23. And for those of you who don't know why the movie is called 23, you haven't read enough of my books yet, obviously. 23, 23 is about a guy named Karl Koch, who read my novel Illuminatus, which I intended to change the mind of everybody who read it, to mutate them totally into new levels of consciousness and awareness. As it says near the end of the book, this book is part of the only real conspiracy it discusses. And it changed Karl Koch's mind, certainly not quite in the direction I was expecting. But the message he got out of it is the world needs to be free of secrets. So let's burrow into all the secret files of all the governments and publish what we find. And once he got going on that, he found out he was very good at it. He got into the U.S. Naval Database in Norfolk. Then he got into Lawrence Livermore Laboratories, where, as Buckminster Fuller once said, most of the best minds of the American scientific community have devoted themselves for 50 years to the single project of delivering more and more explosive power over longer and longer distances and shorter times to kill more and more people. This is a remarkable use of human intelligence. Apparently, if the Cold War hadn't ended, they'd reached the point where they could kill everybody in 1 nanosecond, and then they would have achieved the goal of American financial policy in the last 50 years. He got into Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. He got into everything. He got into the FBI, the CIA. He was all over the shop. And then, because he was more interested in cocaine than in the kind of drugs I think are beneficial, which I shall not name lest I get hauled off and arrested, you might make a few guesses after reading some of my books. Klaus got an even more wonderful idea, at least it seemed wonderful to him. His idea was, instead of just distributing this information free, let's sell it. So he contacted the KGB. And pretty soon he had more fucking cocaine than anybody in Germany. He was rolling in cocaine. And the more cocaine he had, the more time he had to spend at the computer sniffing and searching, finding out more and more secrets, selling them at higher and higher prices, sniffing and searching. The KGB knew more about what was going on in Washington than the president did, probably. Certainly more than the media know. And then Klaus was found dead in the woods at the age of 23, on the 23rd of the month. He was fascinated by 23s as a result of Illuminatus. Apparently my books affect different people different ways. Anyway, they wanted me to appear in the movie as playing myself. And I thought it over, and I said yes. I figured, like Orson Welles said, every conversation is a performance. All I had to do was be myself. I didn't have to do a lot of method acting and asking, what is this character really aiming for? What is his true motive, and so on. I know pretty much what my motive is most of the time, or at least part of the time. You know, when somebody mentioned the Roosevelt Hotel in one of the speeches, I was wondering which Roosevelt Hotel was he thinking about. There must be, there's a Columbus in every state. There may be a Roosevelt Hotel in every big city. When he mentioned the Roosevelt Hotel, my mind went at once to the Roosevelt Hotel in Beverly Hills, because I have taught there at a couple of neuro-linguistic programming workshops with Richard Bandler and his staff, and the Roosevelt Hotel is the one in Beverly Hills is a very interesting place, because lots and lots of people have seen Clifton Webb's ghost wandering around the halls. I did not get to see Clifton Webb's ghost, but it still creates an interesting. Very few hotels have an atmosphere like that, where you think you might run into the ghost of an actor you remember from your childhood. And the other thing about the Roosevelt Hotel is that Charlie Manson worked in the lobby as a pimp about 20 years or 30 years ago. So that gives it another atmosphere. Charlie was up for parole against recently and turned down as usual, as I hope he always will be. And he gave an interview to the San Jose Mercury, the first interview in years. And he said one of the most interesting things Charlie said was, In my day, being crazy meant something. Now everybody's crazy. So you see, when you say a simple thing like Roosevelt Hotel, you don't know what it's activating in the person listening to you. It also activates memories that the Roosevelt Hotel double billed. They made the Institute of Neuro-Linguistic Programming and me both pay for the same room. But, well, anyway, that's enough of the Roosevelt Hotel. Neuro-linguistic programming, which I have been very involved in for 3 years now. I read a few books on it before. And then one day I was called up by the Institute, and they wanted me to teach at one of their seminars. And I said, I read a few books about it, but I don't know enough about it to teach. And Brahm, who does most of the recruiting, said, Dr. Bandler says, you're an expert on neuro-linguistic programming. It's in all of your books. So I thought, how the hell did I become an expert? I never thought I'd be an expert on anything. I can't even find my dick with both hands if the light's out. How can I be an expert on anything? When I met Dr. Bandler, he explained, I use NLP in all of my books. When I began to understand it a little better, I could see Faulkner uses NLP in all of his books, too. But the fascinating thing about NLP among, well, first place, every book on NLP that Bandler has written that I've read, somewhere near the beginning there's a chapter called The Map is Not the Territory, or if it doesn't appear as a chapter head, it appears in a box in the middle of a chapter, The Map is Not the Territory. And that gives you an idea where the origins of NLP began. It's partly Korzybski and partly Milton Erickson's hypnotic work, but Bandler has carried it into entirely new dimensions. I have seen Dr. Bandler put people into deep trance in 30 seconds, which Milton Erickson was famous for. I think Bandler does it even quicker and more efficiently. And he's very good with people who think they can't be hypnotized. And he does this entirely by means of his understanding of language, how language controls people. When you begin to understand NLP, you realize that Korzybski did not state the case nearly as strongly as it needs to be stated. Korzybski said those who control symbols control us. You might just as well say those who control symbols have the whole world hypnotized. You better become a controller of symbols yourself, or you're going to remain in a trance, a self-hypnotic ideational trance that somebody else laid on you, some guru, a perfect master, or enlightened being, or a teacher, or a guru, or whatever. A perfect master, we got a lot of them around California where I live. A perfect master is only ideal if you want to be a perfect slave. The line between persuasion and hypnosis, like the line between conversation and acting, is not firm. We decide where we're going to draw the line. For instance, the Pentagon sent a couple of officers to be trained in NLP, and they were the ones who went to Congress every year to explain why we needed to appropriate more money for this worthwhile project America devoted so much of its time to from 1945 to 1989, the project of delivering more and more explosive power over longer and longer distances and shorter and shorter times to blow up more and more fucking people. And they were trained in NLP so they could manipulate the Congress better. The question is, were they being more persuasive or were they hypnotizing Congress? It depends on how you draw the line. A couple of congressmen found out about this and went and got trained in NLP themselves. One of them was Al Gore. I saw him at the World Future Society in '89. He was the head of the Senate Committee on the Future then, and he said, I promise not to run for president again until I'm older. I thought, gee, that's a safe statement. He'll be older one day from now. But he had a great debate on television with that guy whose name I can have trouble remembering. When I grew up in Brooklyn, it meant pussy, female genitalia. Quayle, yeah. Yeah, Quayle was running with a guy named Bush. And Bush and Quayle I couldn't read I couldn't see any of their commercials without giggling because it brought back my whole adolescence in Brooklyn. Bush and quail. That's all we ever talked about in high school was bush and quail, bush and quail. Now we got bush and quail running for the top offices in the land. I felt like I was living in a surrealist painting. And if you kept the tape of that debate, run it over, and watch what Gore does to Quayle is continually attacking Gore and the Democratic Party in general for having socialist leftward tendencies, et cetera, and being dishonest and crooked and corrupt and whatnot. And Gore just comes ahead with various points that are entirely off that subject onto things that have to be done. And he always ends with, and what do you plan to do about these problems, Dan? So Dan Quayle is in the position he can't go back to his attack. He's got to answer a question. What are you going to do about this? He's got to start thinking, which is something he's not very good at, which is why Gore won that debate hands down. That's just a little simple application of NLP. Another interesting thing about the use of identity I wanted to discuss tonight. I've written, as I said, my last 3 books were written, the last 3 were written in E prime, which I find a very helpful discipline. Once in Mexico, I tried an exercise suggested by Aleister Crowley, the infamous Satanist, black magician, monster, sadist, etc., a man I admire tremendously because I don't think he was any of those things. I think that was all created by his enemies. But be that as it may, this exercise consists of banning the word I from your speech for 1 week. He doesn't want you to ban it forever like some of the more ardent proponents of E prime want you to ban is forever. But he wanted you to ban it for a week. So I tried going without using the word I for a week. And Crowley suggested if you slip and say I, you should carry a razor around with you. And every time you slip, cut your arm slightly to give yourself negative reinforcement so you don't slip and say I again. I'm not quite as crazy as Aleister Crowley, but then very few people could qualify for that. So instead of cutting myself with a razor, I bit my thumb. And about the 3rd day, I had a very sore thumb, and I was beginning to enter a state of consciousness in which I seemed like a monstrous, an obsessive-compulsive disorder. I thought I should go to the OCD people and say, I got this obsessive-compulsive disorder. I relate everything to myself. I see everything through one narrow perspective. How can I be cured of this terrible thing? By the end of the week, I was in a semi-Buddhist state, and I was beginning to wonder what the hell is wrong with the Western world, that everybody is so hung up on their ego. It's a very interesting exercise. But getting back, I'm just pointing out Koszybski did not discover all the traps in language. You can find traps in language. The more you look, the more you find. Getting back to the use of identity, the book I'm working on now is called... I keep wanting to say Unsafe at Any Speed. Isn't that odd? That's a book by Ralph Nader. No, my book is called Everything is Under Control. It's a sort of it's in a form of an encyclopedia of conspiracy theories and heresies against consensus reality. I discovered you can't write, excuse me, you can't write about conspiracy theories without using the use of identity or degenerating into the kind of convoluted prose that you only find in Henry James. And even though Henry James is regarded as a major American writer, I don't want to get stuck sounding like Henry James. If I'm going to get stuck sounding like any convoluted writer, I'd rather sound like Faulkner. Conspiracy theory can't exist without the use of identity. You really need to use it, which may tell us something very important about conspiracy theory. Now, we are living in a decade, well, we began a couple of decades ago. It began with Watergate. It accelerated in the 80s. It keeps reaching new peaks every year throughout the 90s. Every time I think it's peaked, it doubles in intensity, where more and more people have more and more theories about other people being up to no good. The general opinion of humanity that humanity has of other human beings has sunk to an all-time low. Everybody suspects every other group of being up to something nasty. And when you ask, well, what caused this sociological phenomenon of this generalized distrust that people have of one another, and especially of organizations? People fear unions, people fear government, people fear corporations, people fear churches, people fear one another, people fear all sorts of things. Well, one of the reasons, I think, consists of the simple fact there's an awful lot of conspiracies going on. The government lies to us all the time. They get caught constantly, but the chief qualification to be a politician in modern America is that you have an absolutely shameless personality, which I believe is known in technical psychiatric literature as the sociopathic personality. Nothing can shame you. You can get caught in 10 lies in 10 days, and the 11th day you've got a new lie in great hope that people will believe you. Remember Nixon's last days in office? He was still telling new lies every day, hoping that there was still somebody out there who still believed him. Nobody believed him anymore, but he had faith. He had conned so many people for so long, he was convinced he could go on, he could con them one more time. And even when he resigned, he said, I'm not guilty of anything, I'm just resigning for the sake of form. He was resigning so they couldn't impeach him, but, or it sure looks that way from my perspective. And we had the Iran-Contra in Italy, and this is not unconnected. In Italy, they had the Pay Due conspiracy, which got a lot of publicity in the European press. I was living in Europe at that time. To be exact, I was living in Ireland. And in Ireland, the newspapers are, as all the Catholic priests will tell you, run by a bunch of damned atheists. Well, they're all atheists who were educated by the Jesuits. And there's nobody more subtle than an atheist educated by Jesuits. Like when the Archbishop sent out his letter on God's plan for the family, one of them wrote to the Irish Times, would the Archbishop kindly explain with what degree of metaphor a timeless being can be said to have plans? Only an atheist educated by Jesuits would put a question like that. The Pay Due got a lot of publicity in Ireland and throughout Europe. It didn't get quite as much publicity here. Basically, we're leaving out all the speculation. There's a lot of speculation about Pay Due, like about all conspiratorial activity. What was proven comes down to over 950 members of Pay Due, which was a secret society within a secret society. Licio Gelli, who seems to have been the organizer, only recruited from third-degree Freemasons from the Grand Orient Lodge of Egyptian Freemasonry only. And 900 of them had high positions in the government. They were accused of plotting a fascist coup. They were also, a couple of them, convicted of massive financial frauds. It was discovered that Gelli, in collaboration with Roberto Calvi of Banco Ambrosiano and Michele Sindona of the Franklin National Bank, and a guy named Hernandez Cataya of the World Finance Corporation in Miami, had set up 200 banks that didn't even exist, except in their computers. And these 200 banks that didn't exist made a very happy merry-go-round in which all the cocaine money was being laundered and ending up God knows where, probably in numbered Swiss bank accounts. Calvi, when he was indicted, fled to London and was found hanging from a bridge with his pockets full of bricks, where the rising tide had covered his dead body, which is the threat of the punishment given to Freemasons who betray their fellows in the craft, which indicates definitely that Calvi was killed by Freemasons, or by people who ardently wish us to think he was killed by Freemasons. Michele Sindona was convicted in New York of 65 counts of stock and currency fraud, then was extradited to Rome after Richard Nixon's law firm put up a hell of a 3-year fight to keep him from being extradited, and was convicted of murdering a bank examiner, and then was poisoned in his cell while waiting trial on charges of plotting a fascist coup and complicity in the Bologna 1980 railway bombing. You can see they were a busy and jolly bunch. Well, the cocaine was going through that bank and disappearing into the 200 ghost banks that they had set up. the more this case never dies. There's more investigations all the time. Just recently, a mafioso in Palermo confessed to being the one who had murdered Calvi, strangled him, and hung him from that bridge, which was the first theory put forth by the first book I read about the Calvi case. And it got superseded by all the people trying to prove Calvi was killed by the Freemasons, by the Vatican, by this group, by that group. Apparently he was killed by the mafia for shorting them on a drug deal, or at least this mafioso confessed to that. The Pay-Due conspiracy, all the investigating magistrates in Italy who were involved in it, they all told the reporters Gelli was not the head. Licio Gelli seemed to be the head. They all said Gelli seemed to be the head, but we have evidence the control came from somewhere else. One of them said, I think it was another Freemasonic lodge in Monte Carlo. Another one said he thought it was the Grand Loge Alpina in Switzerland. Researching my book on conspiracy theories, I found an article that claimed the real brains behind Pay-Due was James Jesus Angleton, who was the head of counterintelligence for the CIA, 1954 to 1974, when he got thrown out for doing things in the United States that the CIA is only allowed to do in other countries. Angleton is called paranoid by so many writers that it's hard to separate the concept Angleton and paranoia. The two are intimately related. He believed there was a Soviet mole high in the CIA, and he had his own department and his own budget, and nobody knew what he was doing because he shredded all of his papers every night before he left. This started back in the 50s, before anybody else in Washington was into paper shredding. He didn't want to leave a paper trail of anything. Nobody knew what the hell Angleton was doing except Dulles, maybe, and Dulles' successors. And they probably didn't know either, because Angleton was a very private person and a very strange bird indeed. A.J. Weberman, who has the biggest website you can find, it's 3 parts: the history of the CIA, the Kennedy assassination, and garbageology. Garbageology is what Weberman discovered going through people's garbage, which was his first occupation before he started on the CIA and the Kennedy assassination. He believes that he can prove that Angleton was the brains behind the Kennedy assassination. Be that true or not, everybody can judge for themselves after reading this extensive. If you got the time, if you got a year to take off and go through all the stuff and the file, you might come to an educated opinion about that. My thought as I plowed through this stuff was, if Angleton was behind it, it was because he finally decided Kennedy was the Soviet mole he'd been looking for all those years. You see, once the government stops trusting the people, there's no end to it. As Mailer points out in his novel Harlot's Ghost, every branch of the CIA is ignorant of what every other branch is doing. This is necessary because Angleton was very influential in setting up the structure. He set it up so that a mole in one department might find out a lot about that department if he got into it and got high enough, or she, but they couldn't find out what was going on in any other department. So nobody in any department of the CIA knows what anybody in any other department is doing. So nobody can learn too much by penetrating them. You need lots and lots of moles, and getting even one mole in a high position is pretty hard. But the result of that is that everybody in the CIA suspects everybody else in the CIA of all the things that left-wing paranoids suspect them of. In Mailer's novel, when they hear about the Kennedy assassination at Langley, he described the scene when nobody can look at anybody else because they're all thinking the same thought. Was it one of those departments I'm not supposed to know about? which is what a lot of other people thought later. Once you've defined an enemy that's trying to subvert you, then you need to spy on everybody more and more. And the more you spy on everybody, the more nervous everybody gets. So as the government proceeds down the path of spying on the citizens, remember the government one time was supposed to be our servant. We have completely forgotten about that. We got so used to thinking of them as our master. But the more they spy on the citizens, the more you get the citizens feeling anxious, nervous, paranoid, and a little bit hostile. That's why you see those bumper stickers that say, "Is your church BATF approved?" in memory of Waco. The government is spying on all of us all the time. Well, Kafka, who tried to write the craziest satire imaginable about the excesses that bureaucracy could go to, Kafka never thought of urine testing. Kafka could not imagine a country in which the citizens were obliged to pee into bottles and give it to government agents to take it back to find out what was going on inside their bladder. As Bob says, you all heard of Bob, J.R. Bob Dobbs, short-term interim savior of the Church of the Subgenius. As Bob says, if they can look at your pee in your bladder, what the hell still belongs to you? Well, once people get more and more used to the idea of the government spying on them, everybody's more and more nervous about the government. They start forming committees and groups to fight back. So you get more and more contributions to the ACLU. You get the militias taking another way of opposing the government. You got the Republic of Texas trying to secede. You got FIJA, the Fully Informed Jury Association, which is trying to make sure that every citizen learns eventually that ever since Magna Carta, it has been repeatedly upheld that juries have the right to judge the law as well as the facts. If a judge tells you that even if you don't approve of the law, if you think this guy did it, you got to find him guilty, the judge is lying, he's distorting the law. The actual law upheld by the United States Supreme Court in many decisions upheld in England ever since Magna Carta, you have the right, if you think the law is unjust, you have the right not to uphold that law. And they lie to you if they tell you anything else. So FIJA is trying to undo this thing by their own. This means that the government, as it looks around, it sees hostility everywhere. There's the ACLU, there's FIJA, there's the militias, there's all sorts of right-wing and left-wing cranks. What's the answer? We've got to spy on the people even more. Let's have mail covers. Let's have wiretaps. Let's make sure we know that now they can listen to your phone even when you're not talking on it. They can put bugs in your phone, hear everything you're doing in your house. Do you think that you're not making porno movies? Every time you have sex, you don't know how many government officials are watching. You're probably all porno stars and you don't know it. So as more and more people realize this, hostility to government escalates. Government gets more nervous and spies on the people even more. And this cycle continues up and up and up until the point where either the funding runs out or divine intervention occurs. Otherwise, the paranoia escalates forever on both sides. I don't trust the government, and I often try this. I'll try it here tonight with a group largely of general semanticists. I've tried it with all sorts of other groups. I'll try it with this group. How many of you are willing to hold up your hand and say that every time you have dealt with the government, you have told them the whole truth, nothing but the truth, and held nothing back? You see? One. We got one. My God, you're the first one I've encountered in about 20 years of asking that question. Here's a man who always tells the truth to the guy, and you're not in jail. Amazing.
They let him out this afternoon.
Well, the plain fact is that almost everybody lies to the government all the time because they're afraid of what the government might do to them. That's why people lie to their bosses. They're afraid of getting fired if they tell too much of the truth. And if somebody has the power to put you in jail, fire you, throw you out on the street, put you in a gulag or anything like that, you're going to say what they want to hear. So the result is people in power hear more and more what they want to hear and less of what's really going on in the non-variable extensional world out there. So more and more the delusions get more and more deeply set because nobody ever contradicts them. If anybody does contradict them, they get accused of being intellectual wiseacres and fired. If you belonged to the FBI when J. Edgar Hoover was still alive, you had to see an almost infinite number of godless communists all over this country. If you couldn't see that many godless communists, if you only saw about 5,000 of them, say, you couldn't stay in the FBI because they knew there were millions of godless communists all over the country plotting all sorts of mischief. So you either had to learn to become a talented liar or convince yourself that what the boss believed is the truth and put yourself into self-hypnotic ideational trance and have a head full of shit so you were thinking just like J. Edgar Hoover. And so more and more, the ruling class has a burden of omniscience. Nobody else is allowed to tell them anything of what they see, hear, smell, taste, or otherwise sense of the existential continuum. And they have to, by telepathy or some other method, try to find out what's really going on, while everybody around them has good motives to lie to them. Meanwhile, everybody not in the ruling class has a burden of nescience, which means that anything they see, hear, smell, taste, or otherwise find out, they can't dare talk about if it contradicts official policy. So more and more we drift to the condition of rigidicus bureaucratus, or a maximum snafu, in which nobody knows what the hell is going on, or if they do, they're careful not to talk about it. In such a situation, it is inevitable that all sorts of conspiracy theories should proliferate, and a large percentage of the American population should believe that Eisenhower made a deal with the extraterrestrials in 1957. You can give us your technology, and you can have all the cow's lips you want. And this is no more fantastic than the situation we're actually in which everybody's lying to the government, and the government is too dumb to know it. Although they suspect us, so they spy on us more and more to see if they can catch us in any of our lies. So conspiracy theories will always continue to proliferate until the funding runs out and they can't spy on us anymore, or until power gets desovereignized, as Bucky Fuller used to say, into the internet, and we don't have governments anymore. The other great cause of the popularity of conspiracy theories has to do with information and chaos, two subjects which have fascinated me for a long time. I got interested in information theory the same year I read Science and Sanity. I read Claude Shannon's The Theory of Information, the Mathematical Theory of Communication. And I got fascinated by the fact that information increases exponentially or logarithmically. And a French statistical economist named Georges Andela did a study in 1975 which he tried to estimate the way in which information had increased from the birth of Christ. Why he picked that time to start, I don't know. I would have started a few thousand years earlier than that. But I think he has a Western chauvinist viewpoint and needs a course in multiculturalism. But meanwhile, be that as it may, and it probably isn't, if you take all the information that humanity possessed in the year 1 AD and ask how long it took to double, it took 1,500 years till Leonardo da Vinci was in his 40s. The next doubling took 250 years and happened by 1750. The next doubling took 150 years and happened by 1900 when the first papers on quantum mechanics appeared. A few years later, the Wright brothers got off the ground. The next doubling took only 50 years, and by 1950, we had double the information we had in 1900, which means that my parents and the parents of all of you around my age were the first generation in human history to live through a doubling of knowledge. All the other doublings, nobody lived long enough to experience them. Now information is doubling faster and faster. Jacques Vallée calculated a few years ago it's doubling every 18 months. Meanwhile, Theodore Gordon, an expert on fractal mathematics, the mathematics of chaotic systems, has published a theorem, a paper, showing that as information flow increases, fractal unpredictability increases too. So as information flow increases, the world becomes more and more unpredictable. People without any training in or willingness to try to absorb the mathematical and scientific viewpoints can't see what's going on. They can't see how the information flow is changing everything because it's creating more and more unpredictability. But to just give you, after information doubled the first time after Christ at 1500, in one breeding generation, 17 years is a breeding generation throughout most of human history. And 17 years later, Martin Luther nailed his 95 theses on the door of the church. 17 years, that was the first successful Protestant revolution. 17 years later, Henry VIII started the second successful Protestant revolution. For the next 200 years, Europe was torn apart by religious wars until Jonathan Swift was moved to say, we have enough Christianity to hate one another. When will we have enough Christianity to love one another? An interesting question. After the doubling in 1750, we got the steam engine, the Industrial Revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the United Irish Uprising, the Bolivar Revolution in South America, and the first Mexican Revolution. In the last 10 years, go back to 1987 in imagination to see how unpredictable the world is becoming. Nelson Mandela was in jail. It looked to most observers, like the white minority in South Africa, would never relinquish power. There would be bloodshed and bloodshed and bloodshed until they were practically wiped out, because the blacks were not going to accept a subordinate position anymore, and it looked like a pretty hopeless and disgusting situation. 10 years later, they are sharing power, and Nelson Mandela is the president of the country. In 1987, it looked like the Reagan-Bush policies were going to lead to nuclear war, and there was no way out. 10 years later, the Soviet Union has dissolved, and our government is on a desperate hunt to find new enemies to justify spending more and more money on the major research project of delivering more and more explosive power over longer and longer distances in shorter times to kill more and more people. There's no Soviet Union. The enemy is gone. In 1987, the Israelis were still saying we will not negotiate with terrorists. Now, nobody, you know what terrorist means? It's a media word to keep you from thinking. Terrorists are poor people who are fighting. Rich people don't fight. They hire armies. They hire governments to get armies to fight for them. Poor people have to go out and do their own fighting, so they're called terrorists. When a government says we don't negotiate with terrorists, they're saying we don't negotiate with poor people. Well, what finally happened was the Israelis decided they had to negotiate with Yasser Arafat, and now there's a Palestinian state. When that happened, I said, by God, next Tuesday after lunch, the British government will be negotiating with the IRA. Well, it didn't happen next Tuesday after lunch, but it's happening right now. They are negotiating. And for years and years, the British were saying, we won't negotiate with terrorists, meaning we won't negotiate with poor people. But they have to. Otherwise, the violence will never end. 10 years ago, only scientists and universities were online, and the World Wide Web was just dawning. Now it's spreading fast. The rate at which it's growing changes every time I read an article about the rate at which it's growing. It was doubling every 8 months a year or so ago. Recently I read it's doubling every 4 months, and it's spreading over the whole world. All this happened in 10 years. And these are only a few of the aspects of the tremendous changes we're going through. People have been living in space in the Mir colony for a long time. Shannon Lucent? Shannon Lucent. When she was a girl, she told the teacher she wanted to be a rocket scientist. He said, there never will be a profession of rocket scientist, and if there is, they won't allow women in. She has lived in space for 180 days on the Mir colony. The world is changing faster and faster in more and more ways, and people who cannot understand that this is the result of information flow, changing technology, which changes business, which changes everything else, have to look around for something to explain it, so they look for a conspiracy to blame. Aha! It's the Elders of Zion after all. No, it's the Freemasons. No, it's the Jesuits. No, it's the Bilderbergers. That's because they haven't learned to think in terms of mathematics and information flow and chaotic systems. And I think I'll open it up for questions, just leaving you with my latest Zen koan. Keep the lasagna flying over Roswell. Keep the lasagna flying over Roswell and the ravioli over Area 51. Okay, we will now have a short question period. That's, I don't know. When information doubles faster and faster, wouldn't it cross itself? It's sort of like the Kiki Coco bird fly up its own ass and disappear. So, the scientific or pseudo-scientific or attempted scientific formulation of that is by Terence McKenna, who has figured out that this doubling of information faster and faster has the form of a Mandelbrot fractal, and that means that in 2012 information will be doubling every day at the beginning of the year, then every hour around by summertime, and then every minute, and by December 23rd, 2012, information will be doubling every nanosecond. I can't begin to conceptualize in my head what the hell that means, and I don't think it can go that fast. I think there's got to be a leveling off at some point, not a stopping, but slowing down a little. But then again, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he's right. He refers to this point where information is doubling every nanosecond as the end of history, the encounter with a transcendental object. And I wish the hell he'd tell me what he means by that. But I think we do need apocalyptic language to discuss what, information is taking us to places we can't imagine. That's for sure. Let me, well, the answer is no. I don't think so. Let me enlarge on my answer slightly. In 1842, Dr. Morton discovered that you could use ether in surgery. Before then, most people died of surgery. Surgery was a last-ditch attempt to save their lives, and they generally died of the shock and the pain. Since Dr. Morton, the world has gone through a quantum leap that hardly anybody realized. We can't imagine what it was like before surgery with ether. That was a total change in the condition of humanity. Up until the French Revolution, the average lifespan of the working class was 27 years. The lifespan of people in general was 37 years. The average worker had a loaf of bread and a bottle of beer every day for lunch. That was all they could afford. I could go on and on. The reason they had so many plagues is the germ theory hadn't been discovered by the doubling of information. So they kept dumping the shit in the rivers and then making their bread out of water from the rivers. So one plague after another swept across Europe. And I could go on and on with things like that. They were burning witches all the time. Well, you see, that's what makes horse racing. You got one opinion, I got another opinion.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Communicating is equal because we're sharing time together. So communication can happen.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, if you're just talking all the time and I'm listening, I'm getting your program, right? And
You're very much in danger of very much in danger of accepting my BS as yours, and I'm glad you're resisting it. Keep on fighting. Yes.
How much do you project? How much Bill Gates would be worth at that time?
In 2012. Well, I think by then he will have bought out the United States. It'll be a wholly owned subsidiary of Microsoft. Al Gore will probably be vice president in charge of politics, and that's about as far as my projections go along those lines. I think it's much more likely that we're going to, as we expand off the planet into space colonies and so on, we will be building more and more giant computers in space to store the information so we can find it when we need it. I think more and more the universe will become, well, according to Jack Sarfatti, the universe is a giant computer already. And every system within it is a mini computer within the big computer. We get down to the human brain, which is a mini computer. And inside the human brain, there are cells which are mini computers. And inside that are atoms. Inside them are quarks. And inside the quarks are mini computers. And all of them are localized in time and space, but the information itself is non-local, beyond time and space. I think that's what Oriental religion has been telling us all along. But it's nice to have a scientific metaphor for it, because now I can remember my acid experiences and say, yeah, that's what I was. Yeah, it makes sense now. Yeah. I think I'll take two more questions. I only slept 3 hours last night, and I'm beginning to run down. Yes. Basically, normal consciousness is the objective level on Korzybski's structural differential. The psychedelic experience is suddenly you're in the parabola and it goes on to infinity. Where the hell does this end? Jesus Christ, it doesn't end. How am I ever going to understand this? There's too much there to be understood. That's the process level that Korzybski was talking about. Then you come down, you're on the objective level again, but you don't quite believe in it anymore. You have achieved what Korzybski called consciousness of abstracting, or recognizing the relativity of your reality tunnel in various terms. Hey, where do I draw the line between the government and us? Well, I suppose, like I said, we draw the lines at arbitrary points, like the difference between acting and conversation. I draw the line where Benjamin Tucker drew it. Anybody who tries to coerce, control, or govern somebody else is acting as a governor. Anybody who lets people do whatever the hell they damn please and leaves them alone is not acting like a governor.